The man who killed a ghost. This is the story of the Hammersmith Ghost, the man who killed it, and the bizarre trial that followed. Welcome to Weirdscape. The year was 1803. It was a misty November night in the little rural town of Hammersmith, on the outskirts of West London. Like any other night of the time, all was quiet but for the distant baying of livestock in the fields beyond, broken only by the night watchman calling time every hour and the occasional horse and carriage trundling along the streets and lanes. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, a carriage carrying 16 passengers was passing by St. Paul's Church when the horses suddenly jolted to a halt. Looking up, the driver saw that there was a lone figure in the darkness blocking the road ahead of them. The figure was completely white from head to toe. As the driver was trying to make sense of what he was seeing, it suddenly started moving rapidly forward. Terrified, he jumped off his perch and bolted the other way down the road, leaving the carriage and the bewildered passengers stranded in the middle of the road. Bursting into the Black Lion Inn, the frightened coachman relayed what he had seen to everyone present. But no one was surprised. They all knew about the Hammersmith Ghost, and it wasn't the first time someone was accosted by the apparition. Rumours of a terrifying spectre that was prowling the lanes, fields and churchyard around Hammersmith had been growing in the little town during the previous weeks. The Morning Post reported how this entity was appearing every evening in the churchyard. Some victims reported it looking as if it was covered in white, while others said it was covered in what looked like animal skin. All of them said it was tall, and all of them had been traumatised by what they had seen. One paper noted that women and children were now refusing to venture outside their homes after 5 o'clock in the evening, but men were no less likely to be targeted by the fiend. Thomas Groom, a brewer's servant, encountered the phantom as he and a work colleague were walking through the grounds of St. Paul's Church on their way home late one evening in mid-December. Groom said afterwards, "I had my jacket under my arm and my hands in my pocket when some person came behind a tombstone behind me and caught me fast by the throat with both hands and held me fast. My fellow servant who was going on before me, hearing me scuffling, asked what was the matter. Then whatever it was gave me a twist round and I saw nothing. I gave a bit of a push with my fist and felt something soft like a greatcoat, but nothing was there." The experience left the young man shaken and even had an effect on his health for a short time afterwards. No one knew what these appearances meant or why they were happening. Villagers began to speculate that the restless spirit was that of a young man who had ended things, so to speak, and who had been buried in the churchyard the previous year. At that time, people who had done this were not supposed to be buried in consecrated ground, as it was believed to be sacrilegious. This, townfolk believed, was preventing his spirit from resting. It would explain why the apparition was always seen around the area of the church. The ghost, they said, would appear just as the church bell strikes 1 o'clock in the morning. William Girdler, the night watchman who had been appointed by the people of Hammersmith, also saw the malevolent wraith as he was patrolling Black Lion Lane. It was about 10 o'clock at night when he saw what he described as a tall, whitish figure in the lane moving menacingly towards him. As he approached it with his gun drawn, it suddenly threw its arms up and darted away. Girdler pursued, but it escaped into the night, leaving a strange garment on the ground behind, which Girdler described as a white tablecloth. A ghost there may be, but a prankster there certainly was, on this occasion at least. Locals began to organise in groups and started patrolling at night. There was no organised police force back then in London or the surrounding areas, and there wouldn't be for another 25 years. Parish constables were called out for specific purposes, but watchmen like Girdler carried out many of the civic duties that would eventually be taken over by the police that replaced them. Watchmen themselves were generally appointed for their good character, reliability, and bravery. Patrolling for the Ghost did prove difficult, as the lanes were just too numerous and dark. It was a time when streetlights were a rarity. As the sightings poured in, there were many who began to believe the Ghost was nothing more than a rascal in white attire. Even the watchman Girdler had recovered a tablecloth after pursuing it, but many others were still frightened regardless, and convinced that Hammersmith was haunted. And of course, the sight of any person wearing white at night tended to frighten or agitate any villagers who saw them. A few nights after Girdler had chased the Ghost, a young bricklayer named Thomas Millwood was walking home along Hammersmith Terrace when he alarmed the occupants of a passing carriage, all of whom thought he was the Phantom. And it's understandable why. For some reason, bricklayers of the time wore an outfit of white canvas trousers, a white waistcoat, white shirt, white apron, and white shoes. As the carriage approached, one of the occupants shouted, "There goes the Ghost." "I'm no more a ghost than you are. Do you want a punch of the head?" retorted the cantankerous brickie. Whether relieved or frightened by the response, the passengers fell silent. The carriage passed on its way, and Millwood turned to continue his walk. But he was still in a thunderous mood. It wasn't the first time people had shrieked at him or even fled when he was on his way home at the end of a long day, and it wasn't the first time he had to call out that he wasn't the Ghost, and he was growing tired of it. Returning home, he complained about the incident to his mother-in-law, but she cautioned him about wearing all white during such a panic at night and asked him to be careful to wear his greatcoat over his work clothes so that people couldn't mistake him again. Millwood just reluctantly mumbled that he wished the Ghost would be caught. Sightings of the Wraith continued into the new year, with the papers recording yet another spate of attacks. A woman was seen shrieking as she was chased by the fiend, while passers-by were too frightened to help. Another woman was so terrified by the entity that her loved ones feared she may not survive the trauma. One coachman was travelling late at night along a lonely lane when he saw a figure in white fast approaching him from a nearby field. Terrified, the man fled. When he returned with a dozen villagers, they saw that the reins and harnesses had been cut, and the horses were grazing in a nearby field. Groups of vigilantes, now armed, began to patrol the streets and meadows surrounding St. Paul's, and a reward of 5 guineas was put up for anyone who could capture the fiend. A young customs official, Francis Smith, volunteered to join the hunt, and armed with a blunderbuss, a type of shotgun, he also set out to patrol the town at night too. On the night of the 3rd of January, he went out alone, gun in hand, to search for the troublesome Wraith. It was an unusually dark night and visibility was low. During his patrols, as he turned into Beaver Lane, he met the night watchman William Girdler and explained that he was on the lookout for the Ghost. They briefly spoke, and Girdler said he would return later to help him patrol the lanes as soon as he had cried out the 11 o'clock hour. They agreed on a password so that the returning watchman would not be mistaken for the spectre. Smith was to ask, "Who goes there?" and Girdler would reply, "Friend." The men then parted ways, and Smith continued his vigil in the laneways as Girdler went on his nightly rounds. It was about 10:30 by that stage. The next half hour passed without incident. Despite the almost impossible darkness of the lanes, it was a quiet night, with little but the sound of his own footsteps echoing back from the walls around him. As the hour came round, he could hear Girdler call out 11 o'clock in the distance, and he must have breathed a sigh of relief as he knew the watchman would be joining him soon. Turning into the Black Lion Lane, Smith was still on edge. So far there was no sign of the fiend, but Black Lion Lane was known to be a hot spot for the apparition. The lane was long, narrow, and very dark. Tall hedges on either side obscured any light, even from the moon, and made it very difficult to see. Then, Smith heard what he thought was a second set of footsteps joining the echo of his own. He stopped, but the footsteps didn't. He knew Girdler couldn't have arrived that quickly, but he called out regardless. "Who comes there?" he shouted. But there was no reply. The footsteps continued on towards him without a word, but he could still see nothing. He could only hear the shuffle and clipping of the advancing figure in the darkness. "I will shoot," warned Smith. Nothing. "Damn you," he called. "Who are you and what are you?" Again, nothing. The warning to shoot had no effect whatsoever as the footfalls moved at a steady pace in the darkness up the narrow lane, closer and closer towards the frightened young vigilante, who could still see nothing in the darkness. "Damn you," he shouted. "I will shoot." And then he saw it, just feet away. A figure in white was nearly upon him. Terrified, he lifted his flintlock and fired. But the figure, far from disappearing into the ether, slumped heavily to the ground instead. On hearing the shot, two local men, John Locke and George Stowe, rushed to the scene where they could just about make out the shape of Francis Smith standing over the figure as smoke rose from the fallen phantom and the choking smell of burnt gunpowder filled the air around them. They stared in horror at the figure on the ground. It was no ghost. It was Thomas Millwood, the bricklayer, in his white work clothes, with his face completely blackened from gunshot. He was clearly dead. Smith, suddenly realising what he had done, ran to alert the watchman. Millwood's sister Anne, who had been visiting just minutes earlier, had also heard the commotion and the gunshot, and with a feeling of dread ran toward the lane to see what had happened. There, she found her brother on the ground. She had tried to revive him, but he was already gone. Girdler had been talking to the landlord of the White Hart Tavern when Smith approached, panicked and breathless, telling him what had happened. The men hurried back where the others were waiting for them. Millwood had a large bullet wound in the left-hand side of his jaw. The shot must have been very close, given the coloration of his entire face from the gunpowder. Distraught over what he had just done, Smith asked the men to take him into custody, but John Locke advised him to go home and wait there instead. The group then carried Millwood's body to the nearby Black Lion Inn. The town medic was immediately called for, and a parish constable was later sent to Smith's home, where the young man admitted to the shooting and surrendered himself. An inquest was set for the 6th of January 1804 at the Black Lion Inn and was presided over by the County Coroner of Middlesex, George Hodgson. All those who had witnessed the tragedy and its aftermath were called to give evidence. The town medic, who had examined Millwood, described how the gunshot had entered through the left jaw and then penetrated the vertebrae of Millwood's neck, killing him instantly. At its conclusion, Hodgson told all those present of his dismay that a mere superstition had led to the killing of an innocent young man, and that there were no circumstances that could have justified such an outcome. The jury then returned a verdict of willful murder, and the coroner then ordered that Smith be sent to jail, where he would await trial on that charge. On Friday, the 13th of January 1804, Francis Smith appeared at the Central Criminal Court of the Old Bailey in London. There were 3 judges present to hear the case, headed by the Lord Chief Baron, Sir Archibald MacDonald. John Locke, William Girdler, and the Millwood family were called to give evidence. Smith stood pallid and withdrawn in the dock as the town medic who had examined the body and the parish constable who had arrested him also took the stand. He was then called to speak in his defence. He told of how his repeated calls to identify were left unanswered until the white figure was almost upon him, how terrified he had been, and that in the heat of the moment he didn't know what he was doing. He'd had no malice towards Thomas Millwood himself, and had never had any intention to cause harm to him. Smith also admitted to having drunk alcohol that night before going on patrol. On completion of all evidence and witness testimony, the Lord Chief Justice finally gave his summing up. He declared that Smith was no less guilty of murder simply because he had mistakenly shot one man during an attempt to shoot another. Whether or not he had malice towards the man he had killed was irrelevant. He pointed out that Smith could have, but did not, apprehend the person, and instead gave himself the right to take that person's life. The Chief Judge also voiced his disgust at the spectacle of a vigilante who had been drinking, going around with a loaded blunderbuss over something that was obviously a hoax perpetrated by some antisocial prankster. That being said, there was a large amount of public support for Smith. His evident contrition and remorse for the killing also gained a lot of sympathy from the townsfolk, but little traction in the eyes of the law. It was, after all, still a murder case. The jury deliberated for 2 hours before coming back with the verdict of manslaughter, which was immediately rejected by the 3 judges, who reminded the jury that manslaughter was not the charge. The charge was murder. Unfortunately for Smith, the recent coroner's inquest and verdict at the Black Lion Inn had not allowed any room for manslaughter, because the jury at the inquest had put forward a charge of murder. This gave the court at the Old Bailey no room to find him guilty of manslaughter. They had no choice. They had either to find him guilty of murder or acquit him altogether. Reluctantly, the jury retired to deliberate again and returned with their verdict: guilty of murder. As the recorder handed down the sentence, the young customs official broke down. Francis Smith would be executed at the gallows on the following Monday, and his body would then be sent to a medical college to be dissected. The administration of sentences was swift back then. When the sentence was read out, the Newgate Calendar reported that Smith commanded the sympathy of every spectator present. Those in attendance were clearly shocked at the verdict, but appalled at the sentence. Smith had been dangerously reckless, but no one saw him as a murderer. But then, in a surprising and unexpected twist to the case, the Lord Chief informed the jury that he would immediately report the case to the Crown. Interestingly, It seems that he himself lobbied the Crown to commute the sentence, and did it so swiftly that by 7 o'clock that evening the Crown had issued a stay of execution. Smith's appointment with the noose was postponed while his supporters set to work on their campaign to save him. In a little over 3 weeks, King George issued a letter of full pardon to Smith on condition that he serve a term of 1 year in jail. Many accounts state that it was a groundswell of public opinion and a determined campaign by his supporters that had changed the outcome. But this would not explain the speed of his day of execution, which was only days away. In this case, it's clear the Lord Chief Justice himself had immediately intervened to save the young man from the gallows. It may have been that the judges had not expected the jury to return a verdict of murder. Francis Smith was pardoned on the 14th of July, 1804. In the aftermath of the trial, a local man, John Graham, came forward to magistrates and sheepishly admitted that he may have been the cause of the Hammersmith panic. A shoemaker by trade, he had been angered that his apprentices were frightening his children by telling them ghost stories, and he had decided to teach them a lesson. Dressed in a white sheet, he set out to terrify them one night as they were on their way home from the pub. As it turned out, he did too good a job of it, because he frightened them so badly that they blabbed to anyone who would listen about the ghost in the lane. It's highly doubtful that Graham repeated the prank once he had frightened the apprentices. He was a quiet, well-liked and responsible man, and not prone to causing trouble. But no doubt the local panic caused a spate of copycat pranks across the village, some of them far too serious to be regarded as pranks. Graham, mortified by the trend he had unwittingly started, which had gotten so badly out of control, decided to come forward and report what he had done. Although he was initially arrested, the magistrate decided to release Graham on bail. No punishment was administered or recorded, and no further action was taken. The copycat hoaxer or hoaxers were never found or identified, but that being said, there were also no more sightings. The publicity and its consequences finally seemed to have prompted them to stop, and the Hammersmith Ghost was slowly forgotten. People began to venture out again at night, and the fiend gradually became just an unpleasant memory. And that was the end of the Hammersmith Ghost. For now. Exactly 20 years later, down to the month, the fiend raised its ugly and vengeful head once again when in November 1824, a new spate of sightings were reported. This was one ghost that refused to rest in peace, or to allow anyone else to, for that matter. Victims began to report a tall white figure that would jump out onto the lonely lanes in front of them, frighten them out of their wits, and then retreat back into the night. One young lady, returning from the Angel pub where she worked, was startled by the fiend, who, although it did not approach her, gave her such a fright that she suffered from regular fits afterwards. By December, the attacks were becoming violent again. A man returning home late one night was passing by Black Lion Lane when the spectre jumped on his back, threw him to the ground, and then disappeared. The man was left with a broken arm. A woman was attacked in Turnham Green when the phantom ripped at her clothes and scratched her face with what she described felt like metal claws or hooks. As the accounts burst onto the editorials of the papers again, a fresh new wave of panic spread through the borough. The attacks, as brazen as ever, continued into the new year, but the Hammersmith Ghost's second reign of terror was about to come to an abrupt and humiliating end on a foggy night in mid-February 1825. A Mr. M. Worsley was returning home to Fulham from Kensington at about 1 o'clock in the morning when he saw an apparition on horseback galloping towards him, all in white, its arms outstretched as it made horrific noises. But Worsley was not about to be cowed. He grabbed the reins, pulled at the sheet that was covering the figure, and knocked it off its horse, where it made a whole range of other horrific noises as it was beaten to the ground. John Benjamin, a local farmer, appeared before magistrates the very next day, minus his white sheet, and was charged with unlawfully disguising himself with a view to frightening His Majesty's subjects and assault. Benjamin insisted he only meant it as a joke, but the magistrate was not amused. Whether the authorities had finally found their man or not, the appearances and attacks stopped after Benjamin's capture, and the residents of Hammersmith once again sighed with relief and went back to normal. Another 130 years passed by when, curiously, in July 1955, the Herald, a West London newspaper, ran a strangely cryptic article predicting that the famous ghost was going to appear again the following Wednesday at St. Paul's churchyard. It went on to describe how in 1803 a man had ended things for himself, so to speak, near the church, and that it was his ghost that had been haunting Hammersmith ever since. The article went on to tell the story of a resident whose own family, going all the way back to the 1800s, had seen the apparition, and when his great-grandfather saw it in 1805 on an August night of the full moon, a belief had grown that from then on the ghost would appear every 50 years from that night when the moon was full. As the next 50-year time slot was to fall on the following Wednesday, when there would be the first full moon of August, the Herald pledged that they would be sending a reporter to spend the night in the churchyard in wait for the next appearance. Other papers picked up on the story, and in the days that followed, the church was so exasperated by its new status as a paranormal tourist attraction that they contacted the police and demanded that the Herald warn off the numerous ghost hunters that were threatening to camp out in the holy grounds. At 9 p.m. on Wednesday, August the 3rd, the church gates were locked and the police were put on guard outside. But that didn't stop a vigil of 100 interested wraith chasers and almost as many reporters from turning up and camping outside the church in the hope of seeing something. By 9:30, 3 fake ghosts had been arrested and escorted away, but undeterred, the crowd waited with bated breath. And waited. 1 o'clock came, and 1 o'clock went, with no sign of the spectre. The disappointed crowd began to shuffle away back home. But about 20 enthusiasts decided to stay, reasoning that as they were in British summertime 1955, the ghost, which was from 1803, may not be going by modern daylight saving time, which had only been introduced in the UK in 1916. So by the old clock that the ghost would have been following, 1 o'clock would not be approaching for another hour. And so they waited. And as the clock struck 2, 1 o'clock old time, a sudden and eerie breeze whistled through the trees in the churchyard, and the hushed onlookers watched in amazement as a bright light faded into view at the church wall, before morphing into the form of a glowing figure and then floating across the churchyard toward a tomb on the other side. There it settled for a moment before sinking down into the tomb, and the astonished witnesses could only watch in silence as it vanished before their eyes back down into its resting place. It would be interesting to know if the tomb that the ghost had settled into was actually the resting place of the young man who had ended things. But the name appears not to have been noted by those who were present. It could be said that this finally put the mystery of the real ghost to rest. Unfortunately for poor Thomas Millwood, however, there are reports that his restless spirit lingers on in the Hammersmith pub that he had been carried to after being shot. If so, it has to be one of the cruelest ironies of the whole story that the man was so tired of being mistaken for the ghost that his refusal to identify himself to an armed vigilante resulted in him becoming the very thing he was exasperated about being mistaken for. Hammersmith itself is now a thriving and affluent suburb in West London, with impressive Georgian townhouses, businesses, stores, and even large shopping malls. It's hard to picture the area as a small rural village these days. The Black Lion pub still stands with its doors open, still serving customers as it did over 2 centuries ago. A plaque adorning one of its walls details the story of the famous case. Of course, all those involved have long since gone and now lie in their graves, unlike the ghost itself, or in fact the legal arguments that the case gave rise to. Believe it or not, the question of a person's right to attack in mistaken self-defence continued to be debated well into the 20th century, before it was finally put to rest in 1984. The type of self-defence plea that Francis Smith argued, that he was genuinely acting on a mistaken belief, came up again when a man named Gladstone Williams intervened when he saw a young man shouting for help as he was being roughly dragged along a street by another man. Williams intervened and assaulted the perceived aggressor, but as it turned out, the aggressor was in fact a shop owner trying to apprehend a thief. Williams was convicted of actual bodily harm, but on appeal, the conviction was quashed. At the appeal, Lord Chief Justice Lane pointed out that even if the jury came to the conclusion that the mistake was an unreasonable one, if the defendant may genuinely have been labouring under it, that mistaken belief, he is entitled to rely upon it. The appeal was allowed, the conviction was overturned, and the judgment was approved by the Privy Council. The legal argument that Francis Smith had used in his defence in 1804 was finally written into law over 200 years later in the Criminal Justice Act of 2008. Good night, wherever you are.